welcome back to Old Testament Interpretation 1. During this class session, we're going to be, over the next two videos, we're going to be talking about Elijah and Elisha and the early period of the Northern Kingdom. And in the next module after this, we will talk about the fall of the Northern Kingdom. And then we'll finish out the semester by discussing the end of the Judahite kingdom, bringing us to the end of the book of 2 Kings, and thus the end of the Deuteronomistic history. In the next semester of this class, we're going to discuss the prophets. And so we'll come back over some of this history. This will feel kind of compressed in a way. I mean, almost the entire history of the monarchs of Judah and of the northern kingdom of Israel, we're going to talk about in just the matter of a few videos. So in the spring semester, we'll come back to this this time period, and we'll go back over it a bit more slowly when we think about the prophets that were associated with these particular these centuries, in particular Amos and Micah, Hosea, Isaiah in the 8th century. So those are the kind of earliest prophets that have books written about them and named after them in the Bible. And then we'll also talk about the period of the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem, which will go by very briefly in the end of this semester, but we will dwell on that moment in the second semester with the prophetic books of Jeremiah and of Ezekiel. And then we'll discuss what happens after with the reconstruction of the kingdom. So just to situate us where we are and to get us to think about the flow of the semester. So for this class, for this couple of videos, we're going to be discussing Elijah and Elisha, who don't have a book named after them, but who really, in a way, take over the book of Kings. The book of Kings is purportedly about the kings, but as we'll see, it turns into the book of Elijah and Elisha in the middle, and then it returns to the kings again after the point of Elisha's death, really, in 2 Kings 9. So all told, that this is where we are. That's our plan for the rest of the semester. Just to give you a warning, we're going to be talking about some kind of difficult topics today. Violence, we will talk about, and we will talk a little bit about violence that has occurred in the United States that has been discussed in the media. So I'm sure people are aware of this, but over the past couple of years in particular. So just to say this. There's some heavy topics that we'll be discussing. In light of that, I'm going to open us with a prayer that was written by Walter Brueggemann, a professor at Columbia Theological Seminary for many years. This is a prayer that he wrote when teaching 1st and 2nd Kings in seminary. So let us pray. You we name as Lord, Sovereign, King. You we confess governor over nations, empires, and kingdoms. You in your holiness remain hidden, evoking our extravagant doxologies. Your rule draws close and visible among us when we see new possibilities break out or watch the rise and fall beyond explanation. Your rule draws close when you dispatch prophets, messengers, and angels who dare to say, "Thus says the Lord." You dispatch your sovereign word through human utterers, preachers, poets, artists, various dissenters and dreamers. We thank you for your word of governance, even though we often do not want to be addressed by dreams or breaks or possibilities. We most certainly do not want to be bearers of such dreams, breaks, or possibilities because we are mostly agents of steady equilibrium. Nonetheless, we dare yearn for your word and occasionally utter it. We thank you that we do not live in a world unaddressed. We thank you that you are not a God unuttered. So we pledge, as we are able, to listen and to speak, being available for your word that is full of grace and truth. Amen. This is George Floyd. On May 25th, Minneapolis police officers arrested George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, after a convenience store employee called 911 and told the police that Mr. Floyd had bought cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill. 17 minutes after that first squad car arrived at the scene, Mr. Floyd was unconscious and pinned beneath 3 police officers, showing no signs of life. The murder occurred in the wake of many other killings of unarmed black men and women by predominantly white police officers. And many have occurred in the months since: Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, We by now have all heard of the events of Ferguson, Missouri, which were prompted by the killing of Michael Brown by Officer Darren Wilson, and the national, even global response to Eric Garner's last words that were shared by George Floyd, "I can't breathe." And we have all recently heard about, perhaps participated in, protests uplifting the sacred value of black lives that have occurred all over the globe, starting this summer, and that continues still. We can see in these events and in these protests and in the ensuing militant police activity and media blowback that responded to them, that there is often a divide between what our nation thinks it is and what it does. The protesters call for justice to be meted out, quite often on the justice system of our own country. We say that America is a land of opportunity, a melting pot, a place for all people. Bring us anyone who is oppressed at home, your poor huddled masses, bring them here to the land of freedom and equality and democracy. But we also have an epidemic of police officers shooting defenseless black people. We have an epidemic of our justice system doing anything but seeking justice. So we can see that there is actually a difference. There is a sort of hole, in a way, between the justice system and justice itself. The events occurring over the course of American history, really, show us that there is a justice beyond our justice system, a justice beyond justice, a power beyond earthly power that can judge our systems and that we hope and pray can begin to make things right. We can see this in the book of Kings, that there is a political and theological idea that was consistent in ancient Israel and in ancient Judah, in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, that there was a justice that was not fully contained by the justice system of the nations in which they lived. That even the kings, the greatest of their kings, King David, could be judged by a prophet, could be judged by God and found wanting and need to repent and need to change, to transform. They knew that the reality on the ground was not what God wanted. So into this vast gulf step the prophets, like Nathan. They are the ones that are tasked with this difficult job of telling the leaders, the rulers, those who have the power, that they have done wrong, that they must repent, they must change, perhaps even that they will be judged, that they will be removed from power by God because of their shortcomings, because of their violations of the basic sanctity of human life. The idea in ancient Israel was that God was king, and that the human king would reflect God's rule in the kingdom, protect the orphan and the widow, read the Torah, that the king would act on God's behalf and be, in a way, God's mediator of grace and love and truth to all the peoples. Well, what do we say to this vast gap between justice and the system of power? Well, we can look to the prophets in the Old Testament who stood up to tell powerful people that they weren't abiding by the covenant, that the promises that God had made to them didn't mean that they could take advantage of whoever they wanted to, that the justice beyond the justice system was coming to bear on the system at hand, that the true power beyond earthly power will get involved to make things right. Maybe not on our timetable, maybe not by our rules, but eventually God does get involved. In ancient Israel, prophets constantly reminded the kings that they weren't holding up their end of the deal, that God was unhappy with them. The kings pursued power and riches, like Solomon, self-gain, self-empowerment, like David, instead of justice and righteousness. We hear about this throughout the book of Kings. Not many of the kings are actually good, right? Josiah and Hezekiah are praised, King Asa a little bit, but not many of them at all. The book of Kings evaluates the kings and finds them wanting primarily for ethical and theological reasons. They didn't worship God. They didn't obey God's law. This is incredible in the ancient Near East. Saying bad things about a king would get you killed, would get you tortured, would get you in serious trouble. But it seems that Israel and Judah supported a prophetic tradition that was deeply critical of those in power. Prophecy wasn't about some distant day in the future when all things would be made right. The prophets were talking about their own context, their own day, and what God was going to do for the people who were hearing them speak. If God can't do something for hundreds of years, then the prophets weren't going to tell them about it. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about prophets, about how prophets work in the ancient Near East, about how prophets existed in ancient Israel and Judah. Don't worry, I'm not telling you that the prophets have nothing to say about Jesus, but I think we need to take a couple extra steps to get there. We'll talk about this more in the next semester. So before we jump into Elijah and Elisha, we should ask ourselves, what in the world are prophets? What do we mean when we say a prophetic ministry or something like that? Well, what I'll tell you about right now is about the ancient Near East. Remember, ancient Israel is an ancient people in the midst of an ancient context which is much older than them and from which they come. That is, that the Israelites come from Egypt, they come from Mesopotamia, they come from Syria, they come from those regions, and they join into a group of people who are ancient Near Eastern people. They have all those traditions. They have those expectations that we've talked about before, those cultural expectations. One of them is prophecy. Every single culture that we know of in the ancient Near East has prophets. That is, we have records of them. We know what they ate. We have records of how they were paid. We have records of where they stayed. We have sometimes, not much, we have some evidence of the exact things that they said. We have some evidence from two places in particular, from Neo-Assyria, during the reign of one king in particular, and then we also have from about 1,000 years earlier, from the reign of King Zimri-Lim of Mari, a place that was in Mesopotamia, kind of northwestern Mesopotamia, kind of on the fringes of what would later be called Babylon. But this kingdom preserved the prophecies of ancient prophets, precisely because the king appreciated them and liked them very much. Now, we'll get more into the details of what prophecy is, where it comes from, and how to understand it in the spring. We'll spend an entire module on the basic idea of prophecy, but here's a crash course in prophets. Prophets are not special to ancient Israel. Everyone has prophets. So ancient Israel participates in the religious traditions of the peoples around them, like sacrifice, right? Sacrifice is different in Israel, but it's not unique to Israel. Prophecy is different in Israel, but it's not unique to Israel. So if we learn about what actually existed as prophecy in the ancient Near East, then we can understand a bit more about what's happening in Israel in particular. So what is prophecy? Prophecy is receiving messages from the divine world, from the gods, or God. If you happen to be in Israel, there's only one. But everyone else believes there's many, right? So if you receive information from the divine world and then pass it on to people, and if you are a person doing this, then you're a prophet. Prophecy is part of a larger complex of finding information from the divine world and passing it on, like omen readers, people who can look at the stars and tell the future in the ancient Near East, or people who look at the flights of birds, or people who look at animal organs, which is a very popular thing to do, to predict the future. There was an understanding that the gods were trying to send messages to people and that certain experts could understand them. Now, in ancient Israel, there's in the Bible, we have a lot of reticence about, and a lot of, in fact, we have rules against omen reading, like reading omens in the stars, reading omens in animal livers and things like this. We have some evidence that Israel actually did this, that people thought that these things could tell them the future, but that in Deuteronomy it says don't trust this stuff, right? Don't pursue that. But the peoples around them, this was very common, and in fact, prophecy was a very low-class art form of omen reading among the nations around Israel. So in Egypt, let's say, we have very few records of prophets. We know they existed, but they don't seem to be very important. In Mesopotamia as well, they are often unnamed, they're anonymous, they seem to have lived at the temple. They got no special training. The people who read omens would be trained, especially they came from the upper classes, they were learned, they could write and read. The peoples who were prophets were probably born into families that were trained to go into ecstatic prophecy. They could receive messages from the divine world, they believed, direct messages. They didn't have to read anything. They were probably unlearned people and probably pretty poor, but they would hang out by the statue of a god in a temple where the god or goddess was understood to manifest. And they would simply sit there and just wait to receive messages, and then they would go give those messages. When they gave messages, they would use the messenger formula. So when a messenger, not just a messenger of the gods, but any messenger showed up at your door, that messenger would say, "Thus says," and then they would say the name of the person that they were representing. So if the king sends a message, let's say King David sends a message, you open up your door and it says, "Thus says King David," and then the messenger would give the message and then would end by saying, "Thus says King David." The purpose of that was so that you knew what words were the king's words and then what words were the messenger's words, right? The messenger says, "I need some water." Well, King David doesn't need the water, the messenger does, because the messenger's tired from showing up there. And then when the messenger says, "Thus says King David," and then gives the message and then ends with "Thus says King David," it's very clear what David has said, what the message is, right? This is why the prophets are famous in Israel for saying, "Thus says the Lord." The Lord is usually in all caps there, and that's the name of Yahweh. That's the personal name. "Thus says Yahweh." So if you were a prophet in the ancient Near East and you were a prophet of Marduk, the major god of Babylon, you might say, "Thus says Marduk," or "Thus says Baal," or "Thus says El," or "Thus says Yahweh." So the prophets, you can think about the prophets as kind of God using something that was already very common in the environment around them, like sacrifice, in order to teach Israel something and speak to them, right? It's kind of like God using technology that was available at the time to be able to communicate with ancient Israel according to their expectations. So that's how Israel participates in this. But there are some things that are distinct and different about ancient Israel and their prophets. Israelite prophets are different from the prophets around them for a number of reasons. One is that they end up writing giant books about their work, or other people write them about them, or collect their prophecies, right, and edit them into these giant books, like the book of Jeremiah or something, which, by the way, Jeremiah didn't write. It starts with the superscription, like these are the words of Jeremiah, right? Somebody else wrote that. But then also a lot of the stories of Jeremiah are in the third person. This happened to Jeremiah. That happened to Jeremiah, right? Someone else is writing this stuff down. Who was it? Well, one suggestion is Baruch, the guy named in the book of Jeremiah as the scribe who wrote all this stuff down. So there were people who were prophets giving the messages, and there were other people who were writing the stuff down that they said and did, preserving it and passing it on. We see this in other ancient cultures too. Other prophetic traditions, like in Mesopotamia, they left records of some of what the prophets said, but there were always other people writing them down. The prophets were often illiterate. In Israel, though, they collect all these words of the prophets. They aren't just written in letters and things like this and sort of disposable pieces of information like they almost all were in the ancient world. Instead, they collected them and they wrote them down on parchment, on leather, in big books, right? And put the name of the prophet all over the book. So the prophets in Israel were of an elevated stature. They were respected more than in the peoples around them generally. This is also true for some other very close cultures, some other cultures from the Levant or from the area right around ancient Israel in Palestine. So, for example, there are other recordings. You'll see this more in the spring when there's more time to talk about this. But all told, around in ancient Israel, there was more of a veneration of prophets or respect for prophets than elsewhere. So their names were remembered. Their prophecies were slightly more were treated as slightly more important. The oracles, the spoken words of prophets, the messages that the prophets delivered, those are called oracles, were written down, compiled, edited into books in ways that were unheard of in the surrounding world. This is part of a transition in ancient Israelite life and theology and religious practice that is scripturalization, that is the creation of scripture, sacred scripture, which isn't something that's important to ancient Mesopotamians or wasn't terribly important to ancient Egyptians. They had sacred writings, but they didn't think of them as a canon, right? A sacred text that was the most important thing in the tradition. This is something that ancient Israel seems to invent, and the collection of things like the Deuteronomistic history, the collection of, say, the Torah, and the collection of the prophetic texts seem to be part of this process. We'll explore that process more in the second semester of this course. But just so you know, this is kind of part of how that works. But another big thing that separates ancient Israelite prophets from the prophets of the nations around them is their ability to speak truth to power, to say something about the law of Moses, and that the law of Moses applies to those people on top, even those people who think that they are kind of covered by the Davidic covenant, right? That God has chosen them, and there's nothing that they can do to end that. Well, the prophets remind everyone that the law of Moses, the covenant of Moses, applies to and contains everybody in the community, even the kings, even the aristocrats, even the people who are in charge of all of the systems of power. That is, the justice beyond justice applies to them too. So there's a few different types of prophets that we can see in ancient Israel. They're not all the same thing. That is that there's a wide variety of prophets. There's not one word that means all prophets in ancient Israel. There's a bunch of different words that I'll explain in a moment. Our word prophet in English comes from the Greek word prophetes, which means to kind of Our word prophets comes from the Greek word prophetes, which means basically to speak out about something. But in ancient Israel, the general word is navi. This is a Hebrew word for the kind of, it ends up meaning all prophets, but it means someone who's called out, someone who's called to do something that God calls out. And then there are other words like hoseh and roeh, both of which mean to see something in a special way, kind of spiritual sight. Think about like Samuel when he sees the lost donkeys and finds them, right, in the book of Samuel. So the ability to kind of see and know things that other people can't see and know. But then there's another kind of prophet that's actually quite different from all of the preceding three, and that's an Ish Elohim, the man of God. This is not a title that's given to all the prophets. It describes a special kind of prophet, a prophet who doesn't just receive messages and deliver them, but a prophet who does things that aren't just symbolic. You know, like Ezekiel performs kind of almost like a play acts the destruction of Jerusalem in the book of Ezekiel to show other people what was going to happen. Not like that. The man of God, and it's all men in the Bible who fulfill this role, the Ish Elohim. This particular title is given to prophets who do miraculous acts, and they are in a way a portal through whom God works in the world. It's almost like God kind of emerges from them and does tremendous things, which are both amazing, miracles of giving life, and miracles of judgment, and sometimes miracles that are not about morality as such. They're about the glory of God or the power of God. Remember God being like a nuclear reactor? Remember the priestly texts that kind of get people to think about God's power, which we want to live among us, but it's kind of a problem. The Ish Elohim, this kind of prophet, is someone who can do amazing things in part because God's power is in them, but that also makes them dangerous sometimes. So we'll see these prophets, especially Elijah and Elisha. Those are the two most most well-known of these Ish Elohim prophets. There are others in the book of Kings, by the way. They tend to act anonymously. They are just called a man of God. So in, say, 1 Kings 13, there's a whole story about a man of God who comes and does something. This is a prophet who receives a message from God and gives it, but also does divine acts, does things. One thing we can say is that this is a certain kind of prophet. And so Jeremiah doesn't do miracles. Jeremiah gives messages. Isaiah doesn't really do miracles. Isaiah gives messages, right? We can say that Amos just gives messages. But Elijah and Elisha do special things, which makes them Ish Elohim, man of God. We can also say that this is something that's acted out in the New Testament. As you read the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, you're going to run across things that sound an awful lot like Jesus. Like, I don't know if you know, but in 2 Kings chapter 4, there's a story of the feeding, of a miraculous feeding of people at which there was food left over. That the man of God took some loaves of bread and created a feast for 100 people, and there was food left over. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you, but it sounded familiar to Jesus and to Jesus' disciples, because when Jesus does many of his miracles, he is acting out some of these things that Elijah and Elisha have already done. That is, that Jesus is not just feeding people, he's being symbolic. He's showing that he is a man of God. He is someone through whom, a portal through whom God's power works in the world. So we'll get to why these miracles exist the way they do. In the next video, we'll spend more time thinking about Elijah and Elisha in particular. But for now, that's probably good enough for us to move on. A couple of things. One is that we have evidence outside the Bible from ancient Israel that show us how important prophets were to ancient Israel. Some of these are the Lachish ostraca. An ostraca is a broken piece of a potsherd. These were used as like pieces of paper. So this is a part of a pot. When a pot broke, you would use it as a piece of scratch paper, and you could write things on it like letters that you would then send. And so these are letters found from a Judahite city. The second biggest city in Judah before the destruction of Jerusalem was Lachish. And in Lachish, there's a destruction layer in the archaeological remains, and around the destruction layer there are some of these letters. And these letters are from generals, from the army, the Judahite army, that are writing sometimes about prophets and what prophets are saying. One of these Lachish Ostraca, one of these letters from a general, seems to, at least it seems highly likely that it's in some way referencing Jeremiah and quotes a bit of Jeremiah's words. So again, this is occurring at the time of Jeremiah, but just to show us how important, how what weight was given to the words of prophets within ancient Israelite culture. So this is all to say that when Elijah and then Elisha burst onto the scene in 1 Kings 17, they take over the narrative, in part because the book of Kings is not about glorifying kings. Sometimes it does glorify kings, but most of the time it's a check on kings. It's in a way an evaluation of kings. And when the kings become horrible, are doing things that are transforming Israel and pushing it away from becoming its covenant self, right? Becoming what it's supposed to be in the world, its missional self. For this, I look back to Genesis 12 with Abram and Sarah, and God says, I'm going to make you a blessing to all the nations of the world. Or Exodus 19, when the Israelite people are at the foot of Sinai and they're about to enter into the covenant, and God says, I will make you a priestly people, right, to mediate God's blessing to all the nations of the earth. When Israel moves away from the covenant, from their responsibility to take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, when they move away from their responsibility to be blessings to one another, especially the leadership, God intervenes. And God's intervention isn't always positive. That is, it isn't always nice to the kings. A lot of times there's a destruction. That is that God, just like Pharaoh, God gives Pharaoh many years, many chances, many words of warning, but ultimately God is going to intervene and deconstruct Pharaoh's power in order to liberate people who are being oppressed by Pharaoh. This exact thing happens within Israelite history time and again. And what we might say is that this is the way God works in the world, through prophets, right, is to unbuild and then to try to rebuild afterwards. It's a painful process much of the time. And the exile is a part of this work of unbuilding and then later rebuilding. But that God does. That's at least the claim of the Deuteronomistic history, that God did this for a reason, for a purpose. We need a little bit of a refresher in ancient Near Eastern religion, because it's really important for Elijah and Elisha and understanding their ministry. What were they all about? So remember, in the ancient Near East, everyone believes that there are many gods, that those gods exist in a pantheon, kind of like a big family. This right here is a ancient Babylonian stela, or this giant rock that has been carved with images, and those are images of the gods. Those are their sacred symbols. So Sin and Ishtar and Shamash at the top, the moon god, the star Ishtar, the sun Shamash, the major gods of Anu and Enlil, of Ea and Ninhorsa. And you can see at the bottom there, Marduk, Nabu, and Gula, so the god of Babylon there is at the bottom. These are the major gods of the Babylonian pantheon, right? The family of Babylonian gods. People believe that all these things existed, right? Polytheism is normal, it's accepted. In fact, not being polytheistic would have been very strange, unusual. But we can usually people think about polytheism as being the only option to that is monotheism, right? Believing there's one God. You either believe in one or many. It's really important to say people just would not have understood monotheism in the ancient period. It would have been so strange to them. Imagine getting people here to in 21st century America to think of something they had never thought of before. It's actually really hard to do. It's really hard to get people to understand something that they have never thought of before, that's never been a part of their culture before. So you have to take intermediate steps. So we see ancient Israel take these steps. Most of the Old Testament doesn't tell us there's only one God. Most of the Old Testament kind of assumes that in the form that we have it now, but it kind of slowly brings people up to that point. It mentions other gods by name. right? And doesn't always say they don't exist. But it begins like, so the law of Moses, you shall have no other gods before me. That's in the Ten Commandments, right? It doesn't say, it's the first commandment, right? Or at least according to certain traditions. But that doesn't say that there are no, you have to say there are no other gods. That's not the first step. The first step is to say, don't have any other gods before me, like in my presence. Don't worship other gods here. We call this monolatry, the worship of one God. And that would be a step from polytheism. And then we can say there's another step, henotheism, which is where you kind of stop talking about other gods. You really just talk about the one God, and you're kind of agnostic about whether or not there are other gods. You kind of just, it's not a big, you're not telling people that their God doesn't exist. You just don't really talk about it. And the final step in kind of this long tradition towards the creation of monotheism, that is the statement, there is only one God and there has only ever been one God, right? That is this move from henotheism, kind of, well, let's just not talk about it, to monotheism. That occurs, people argue about where exactly this occurs, but sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC and the beginning of the exilic period, we start to get a sense of the statements like there are no other gods. We start to get this in what we would call the Babylonian period, the exilic period, during the period of the exile, and it becomes stronger as you move on in Jewish history. But so just so we all get this straight, right? In the time of Elijah, it is very hard, even for Israelites, to imagine that there's only one God, or to imagine that you need to choose between gods, because people didn't choose between gods. They would worship Marduk because they were Babylonians, but they wouldn't that didn't mean they chose against other gods. Look, this is the Babylonian Pantheon. There's all these gods here, right? They worship all of them. They have temples to lots of gods. And if someone comes to your town from another place, you don't tell them to stop worshiping their gods. You might worship them with them, right? I mean, so it's kind of a all gods matter kind of thing. That's when you think about polytheism, all of these gods matter. Getting people to make a choice would have been a very strange thing. And that's what Elijah is trying to do, I think. Something we need to talk about is so the name Israel. The name Israel, the name of the people, Yisrael. That's an ale name. It ends in ale. Ale. You can see all these ale names early on in Israelite history, like Samuel, right? Shemuel, because he got an ale name, right? As you move on in history, you start to see more Yah names that end in Yah, which is the short form of Yahweh, the particular God of ancient Israel, like Elijah or Josiah or Hezekiah. If you look at ancient Judahite history, they start with ale names and they move into Yah names. What this might suggest to us is that ancient Israel, over time, becomes obsessed with Yahweh. But maybe they weren't always there. This is, by the way, is an image of Ale from Megiddo, from a city that was Canaanite and became Israelite. But look at Elijah's name. So names are usually in the ancient world theophoric. They have a god's name in them, and they're like a sentence about a god. So Elijah, if you know Hebrew, you have Eliah, Elijah, and that's El, which means God, E, which means me, and Yah, which means Yahweh. Yahweh is my Ale. Yahweh is my Ale, my God. Or it could mean the name El, the high god of the Canaanite Pantheon. Because we'll see the Canaanite gods are the thing that Elijah is talking about a lot. And Elijah is saying, the things that you think that the Canaanite gods do, like bring the rain, make things grow, protect you, etc., those are actually things that Yah is doing, Yahweh is doing. My Ale is Yah. We'll see that Elijah's career is sort of summed up by his desire to get Israel to worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone. As we'll see next semester, this Yahweh alone, this comes from Deuteronomy. This is the language, you will worship God alone, but also in Deuteronomy 6, that's the Shema, right? This kind of statement of Israelite faith in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, the most sacred prayer in Judaism today. God is one way of translating that, but also God alone. Yahweh is God alone. that we only have one God, and that's Yahweh. That's another way of saying that. This becomes kind of a catchphrase in ancient Israel for this group of people who are trying to get the Israelites to only worship Yahweh. And it's a struggle throughout all of ancient Israelite history. Elijah is almost like the patron saint of the Yahweh Alone party. He's one of the first that begins kind of this, I don't know how else put it, a culture offensive, right? He's a protester trying to get everyone to understand and follow him. And he's got this slogan that is at first very unpopular, but ends up catching on. One other thing to talk about before we jump into Elijah is to talk about Baal. So the word Baal in Hebrew, it's a Hebrew word, it's a Canaanite word. It doesn't, first of all, mean a god. The first thing it means, the kind of dictionary definition, is a master or lord. It can also mean a husband. Wives would sometimes call their husbands Baal or Baal. We'll see this language come up in Hosea next semester to talk about God and God's relationship to the people. But all to say, the third thing it can mean is a deity, and it can mean any deity. Yahweh is sometimes referred to as Baal or Baal, that is a lord, a master. The typical word to refer to Yahweh as a lord is Adonai in Hebrew, or Adon, a lord, or Adonai, my lord. But this, there are some occurrences where people use the term Baal to mean Lord Yahweh, right? Like kind of a title of reverence, right? Respect, honor. Then one of the kind of the fourth thing, the most specific thing that you can mean by saying Baal is the particular name of the Canaanite storm god. The Semitic means like people who speak Semitic languages, like Hebrew, like Canaan, like the Phoenicians. The storm god Hadad. His name is Hadad. He's a Syrian storm god, and he would be called Baal Hadad, Lord Hadad. People in Canaan ended up just kind of calling him Baal. People in Egypt adopted this Canaanite god and called it Seth. That's right, Seth is Baal, is the Canaanite storm god. Egypt thought it was pretty cool that they had a storm god and borrowed the storm god from Canaan, and then called it a different name and made it a part of their pantheon, but remembered that it had roots, Semitic roots. It had roots from the Levant. But all to say that when we talk about Baal, we are often talking about, in the Bible, we're often talking about a specific god, the storm god of the Canaanite pantheon, Baal Hadad. Hadad doesn't occur in the Bible, really, except for the names of some other peoples that they encounter, foreigners who have Hadad in their name. But it kind of becomes shorthand for this Canaanite storm god. But it's important for us to realize this is a particular god. It's not the devil. It's a storm god. It's a god who brings rain and fertility, fecundity, right? Crops grow because you pray to this god. This is a god that is all about profit. This is a god who's associated with major plantation centers, and we can call them that. They're large farms in which people are often, like peasants, are kind of forced, sometimes indebted, sometimes they're paid a bit, to farm on these large enclosed farms, these large farms that are kind of surrounding a giant farmhouse sometimes, and that would be associated with city centers, right? Big cities. In other words, there would be a king in a city in Canaan, say Megiddo, that would have a large territory that would be farmed by peasants and so on. And Baal was venerated in these big spaces because you wanted to bring the rains, because the rains would bring the crops, and the crops would get those kings filthy rich, right? That was why Baal was venerated. Bring the crops, bring the rain, so that things can grow, so that we can make some money, right? So Baal is associated with kind of big business in a way. And Hosea is a prophet who makes fun of Baal precisely for this purpose. That Baal doesn't really bring the profits, is what does Baal profit you, is what Hosea asks. Okay, all to say that these things are really important to keep track of with Elijah, because Elijah talks a lot about rain, about water, about crops growing and things like this, about life, bringing out life, who's the God who's alive, who's the God of life, because these are things that Baal was associated with. So, but Elijah's point is that these are things that Yahweh is actually in charge of. So the conflict makes a lot of sense if you know this about Baal. It's not just a general god in the ancient world, but it's the particular storm god of ancient Canaan, and was understood to be the god who was like the most active in the world, and the one who was kind of you can see this is an image of Baal also from Megiddo, the city that becomes Israelite, is a Canaanite city. He's wearing a pharaoh hat, right, an Egyptian pharaoh hat, because he's kind of like a king. He's like a king god, and he's would have been holding a lightning bolt or something like that, because he brought the storms, right? He rides on the clouds. These are all things that are also said of Yahweh in the Bible, but even one psalm, Psalm 29, is really, it's about Baal, the storm god. And ancient Israelites borrowed the song, borrowed almost all the lyrics to this hymn, and then replaced Baal with Yahweh. That is to say that there was a fight in ancient Israel between who really does control the reigns, who controls the cosmos, who controls life and death, who is the living God. So, to kind of give this another way of seeing this, the Pantheon, right? These are kind of, man, this is Ale above me right here. That's Ale, who was understood to be kind of a drunk god. He created the world. It was kind of like long ago. He was a really cool, powerful god, and then he kind of got old, began to drink a lot, and then Baal, who's here, takes over, and you can see Baal's kind of holding like a lightning bolt spear, standing on the clouds. He's got a club above his head because he can hurt people. He kind of takes over as the active god, and in fact fights the god of death, Mot, according to the Baal cycle, this cycle of stories that exist from ancient Canaan that we can read today. We found that archaeologists found and translated and so on. That it's in a language called Ugaritic. It's from an ancient city called Ugarit, a Canaanite city, and it preserves these ancient Canaanite legends, which are about Baal's power and majesty. There's Asherah, by the way, over there, Atharat, the mother goddess. She's the goddess of kind of growth and, kind of along with Baal, kind of is about the production of the world, generativity and so on. But all to say, so the idea in 1 Kings, starting with 1 Kings 16, really, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but the idea is not that, say, Omri or Ahab, these kings of Israel, the idea is not that they hated Yahweh and tried to get rid of Yahweh worship. There's suggestions that Jezebel tries to do this, the queen, but really the emphasis is not so much on getting rid of Yahweh worship. It seems that no Israelite king tries to do this, really, to get rid of Yahweh worship. No, they just wanted to include Yahweh worship. Here's the Ark of the Covenant, right, symbolizing Yahweh's presence. They wanted to include Yahweh worship along with other worship, right? King Ahab of the northern kingdom has temples to Yahweh. He runs them. He worships there. He loves Yahweh. He just also loves Baal and El and Asherah, right? He's trying to include Yahweh within this pantheon of gods. Now, I explained this a little bit ago when we talked about Joshua, when we talked about kind of some of the conflicts between the law of Moses and Canaanite practice. That is to say, there was an actual difference, at least among, if you kind of compare the laws of Moses to what we know of ancient Canaanite land practice and governance and the economy and so on, class structure, we know that Deuteronomy tells people not to live like Canaanites. And what this means is don't live in city-states where there are like huge peasant populations, right? There shouldn't be an elite that owns all the land, which was the idea of the ancient Near East, is that the kings own all the land and you get to farm it. The world isn't created that way, according to Deuteronomy, according to Genesis, right? Every single person is imbued with this relationship with God, right? God speaks and addresses, Yahweh, the God of Israel, addresses all of ancient Israel and engages in a covenant with all of them, promising all of them land. And if they don't have land, then they have to redistribute their land, according to Leviticus 25. Everyone gets access to productive land. Everyone is going to be taken care of. And if anyone is in a position where they're not taken care of, well, then they need to be taken care of, right? Deuteronomy 15, everyone's got to be taken care of. Help people in need. You have to help the poor, the widow, the orphans, anyone who cries out and help anyone oppressed, cries out to God, God's going to hear them and listen to them, and so you have to take care of them. This is the basic idea of the covenant in ancient Israel, right? This is why Yahweh is not involved in the pantheons of the people around them. Remember how Baal was taken into the Egyptian pantheon? Because Baal, the system of Baal and the system of Egypt are quite similar. They're compatible. Yahweh's system is different than the Canaanite gods, is different than Egypt's gods, is different than Mesopotamian gods. Yahweh's got a different way of seeing the world. At least that's the claim of Elijah and the claim of Elisha and the claim of Jeremiah, the claim of Isaiah, the claim of all of these major prophets was that no, Yahweh actually is different and cannot fit within your system because Yahweh is asking you to break that system because that system is oppressive. If you domesticate Yahweh and make Yahweh a small god among many gods, well, then you're no better than Pharaoh, according to Elijah and Elisha and Jeremiah and so on. No, Yahweh asks particular things that these gods are trying to stop, because Baal and El and Asherah, they like to make it rain in the cities, in the major positions of power for the kings. Yahweh wants to change that entire system. So if you just have if all gods matter, then Yahweh doesn't matter. So there's a tension, right, between the message of Yahweh and the message of these surrounding gods. And that's what Elijah is trying to get everyone to understand. You can't domesticate Yahweh. You can't, if you try to take away the harsh edges of Yahweh's message, you're taking away Yahweh entirely. Then Yahweh's gone. So this is, in a way, similar to the message Black Lives Matter. You've probably heard people respond to Black Lives Matter, that message, the basic message that Black lives do matter. People respond to this sometimes in a defensive way. Well, all lives matter. No. Well, of course Black lives matter, but you don't have to say it, right? All lives matter. If you say Black lives matter, you're lifting up certain lives and not others. What about me? I'm white. What about my life, right? Doesn't my life matter? But all lives matter is an attempt. When I say all lives matter in response to someone saying Black lives matter, the response really means let's keep things the way they are. Because right now it seems to white people, or at least many white people, that in the United States, that all lives do matter right now, right? So don't change anything, right? But of course, from the perspective of Black experience, Black people are saying we don't matter as much as white people in the system as it currently exists. So saying Black Lives Matter is important precisely because this is the element that is being suppressed and oppressed and excluded in order to create a system where white people think all lives matter. So the particularity is the important point. And it's also the point that is going to make people the most defensive and the most upset. Because if you press that particularity, if you say Black lives matter, Black lives do matter, and you try to make them matter, you try to make the system recognize that they matter, and try to treat people equally, you will actually upend and in some ways destroy the system as it currently exists. This is a bit similar to the struggle between Elijah and King Ahab. Canaanite theology tells people that all gods matter. We're a pantheon. Yeah, bring all those gods. Bring that god, bring that god, bring that god. This is a bit like all lives matter. Oh yeah, sure, everyone matters. Just make sure everyone's in the pantheon, right? But the pantheon has a hierarchy to it. There is a natural, or at least naturally seeming to the people who are part of it, order, structure, in which some gods are at the top and some gods are at the bottom. Some people's lives are at the top and some people's lives are at the bottom. And that's when it seems to be like, oh yeah, everyone's life is mattering now, right? In the ancient world, a peasant's life mattered only if they stayed a peasant. If there weren't peasants, then some people couldn't be, elevated as the aristocrats. So all lives matter meant peasants have to stay oppressed. In response to this, we get this Yahweh Alone theology, which we might call Israelite prophetic theology, the theology that ties together Elijah and Elisha and Jeremiah, that you can see in the work of Micah, you can see in Amos, you can see in Hosea, and so on. These prophets, they all have differences between them, but one thing that ties them all together is this claim that has its roots in the Mosaic covenant, which says that marginal lives matter, that oppressed lives matter, that the person who is crying out because they are oppressed, that life matters. God, Yahweh, hears the voice of the wandering person who has been oppressed. Yahweh hears the blood of the oppressed that's crying out from the ground. Yahweh hears the cry of those people who have been dispossessed of their land or dispossessed of their inheritance or their God-given right to be able to provide for themselves, right, and to survive. This is what's represented by the claim that Yahweh's life matters. Yahweh is the living God, according to Elijah. And what he means is that marginal lives matter and that Yahweh cares about them. And we'll see that in the stories of Elijah and Elisha. I know this is a bit abstract almost, a bit philosophical in a way, but I think it's really important for us to see that making a decision, if you think there is a decision to be made between Yahweh and Elijah, Yahweh and El or Baal and the Canaanite gods, if you think there's a decision, so if you think that there is a decision that has to be made between Yahweh and El and Baal and the Canaanite gods, that in itself means that you're a follower of Yahweh. If you think that certain particular lives need to be privileged, or that Yahweh needs to be privileged above other gods, those things are linked. They're tied together. They're the same thing. In ancient culture, right? In ancient Levantine culture, the culture of the surrounding peoples of ancient Israel. This is why Yahweh is shunned by the peoples who surround Israel. In fact, the only people who try to stick Yahweh into a different pantheon are the Israelite kings. Everyone else around them thinks that Yahweh is a bizarre God because Yahweh demands the upending of their society upon which they depend to become a king, to be a king. So, all to say that this is a bit abstract, philosophical, perhaps. I know that this is a bit strange, even, but just to say, this is going to come up time and again, and this makes Elijah and Elisha make sense, at least to me. One thing we'll talk about before I end this video, and then we'll move on to Elijah and Elisha's stories. We'll have one video on Elijah and then one video on Elisha's stories. The situation of the northern kingdom, right, is a situation of, as Professor Yoder has pointed out, kind of terror, destruction. It is a strange transition from Jeroboam, right, who starts this kind of seemingly strong kingdom to the north. There is a major transition that happens into chaos, as Professor Yoder has pointed out. There's the instability of Zimri and Baasha and so on that ends in the victory of Omri, right, who was a general in the army and who takes over as king. You can see this in 1 Kings chapter 16. One important thing, Omri is not an Israelite name. Omri is not an Israelite. We're not exactly sure where he's from, but Omri is definitely not an Israelite name. So Omri is a general in the army, and you might say, well, if he wasn't an Israelite, how's he in the Israelite army and a general, right? I mean, so is Uriah the Hittite, right? That is, there's a tradition of ancient Israelites welcoming people, foreigners, into high ranks in their culture. Caleb, who founds Judah, basically, founds Hebron, the major city of Judah. They keep saying again and again, he's a Calebite. He's not an Israelite. He's not part of Abram's family, right? So there's a long tradition of outsiders being able to be hugely important in ancient Israelite culture. There's a shift that happens in the spring semester. You're going to see this, that there is a shift and a change where Israel, after the time of the exile, becomes more self-absorbed and more defensive, self-defensive, and restricts outsider or seeming outsider presence, right? But in any event, so Omri is able to emerge as the victor of a civil war after Zimri dies, right? Zimri kills himself. He burns down the king's house on himself in 1 Kings 16, verse 18. And Omri then fights a civil war against another general and ends up winning, right? So verse 24, Omri clearly becomes the most famous king outside of Israel in Israelite history. How do we know this? Because the Assyrians, the major power on the stage in Mesopotamia, during the entire rest of Israel's existence and almost all of Judah's existence up until the Babylonian powers take over just before Judah is destroyed. They call the people of Israel the house of Omri, even long after Omri's dead, even after Omri's his entire house is gone, right? Different kings have taken over from different families, and they still call it the House of Omri. That's what everyone knows Israel. They don't know the name Israel. They know the name House of Omri. So all to say, Omri is hugely powerful, incredibly important. He builds Samaria, and 1 Kings 16, verse 24 and on, he buys this uninhabited hill, well, maybe inhabited by one farm. This guy Shemer has this hill, and he ends up making the city called Samaria. If you know Hebrew, shamar means to like watch over, guard, keep. It's kind of this like iconic place where you can observe a lot of places. And he builds this fortified city, a bit like David did, right? He has a new city that he's built. Because there's been all this assassinations of previous kings of Israel, now he's got a place that he can trust, that he can run, that he can, no one else has lived there before him, so he can build the thing, with his own protection in mind. And he actually does build a dynasty that is able to control Israel for several generations, which hadn't been done in recent memory in the northern kingdom. So all to say that Omri is powerful, is able to consolidate power, but one of the other things that he does, remember, he's not an Israelite, is that he does what's evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the Deuteronomistic historian in 1 Kings, and begins to worship other gods. And then, verse 31 of 1 Kings 16, Ahab, his son, marries Jezebel, who was a Sidonian, the daughter of King Ethbal. So she's a princess of the Sidonians. Now Sidon, remember Sidon and Tyre, those are Phoenician city-states. Phoenicians are Canaanites. Phoenicia is Greek for Canaan, basically. Phoenicia and Canaan both mean purple. So the purple because of the snail dye, remember? So that their main export. So the Phoenicians are basically Canaanites with boats, and who run a maritime trade empire. So they worship Baal, they worship El, they worship Asherah, right? They worship all these gods. So Jezebel marries Omri's son Ahab, and then Omri's son Ahab, verse 32 of 1 Kings 16, erects an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. So there's a temple to Baal. You'd expect this in the ancient world. You'd expect there to be gods reflecting the local gods of the peoples who lived there. So Jezebel lives there. Of course they're going to build a temple to her god, but also Omri, he doesn't care. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't worship Yahweh. He probably does. Yahweh is the god of the local land. Yeah, of course they worship Yahweh. All gods matter, right? And all lives matter, right? Well, then, the very end of this, and the beginning of 1 Kings 17, we have this abrupt shift where a new character enters the stage who doesn't get much of an introduction, and that's Elijah the Tishbite. So we're going to pick up with Elijah, and all this context hopefully will make Elijah's story make a lot more sense in our next video.